My stepmom tried to rewrite my dad's will for her kids, until the lawyer brought the version she never saw. Oliver here, 32 years old, and 3 months ago, I thought grief was the hardest thing I'd have to deal with after losing my dad. Turns out watching your stepmom try to steal your inheritance while your father's body is still warm is a whole different kind of pain. My stepmom Natalie had been planning her move for years, manipulating my dad's will to benefit her kids instead of me. What she didn't know was that Dad had been one step ahead of her the entire time. My dad Samuel and I had always been close, especially after my mom died in a car accident when I was 16. Those years from high school through college were just the two of us figuring out life together, and Dad did an incredible job raising me on his own while building his successful accounting practice. He taught me about integrity, hard work, and always keeping your word, values that became the foundation of everything I believed about family and loyalty. Dad met Natalie about 5 years ago at a community fundraiser where she was volunteering for a children's charity. She seemed nice enough when I first met her, friendly, outgoing, clearly interested in making a good impression on Dad's son. She worked as a real estate agent and had 2 kids from her previous marriage, Andrew, who was 28, and Melissa, who was 25. Both of them were struggling to launch their adult lives and still lived with Natalie in her rental apartment. When Dad and Natalie got married 3 years ago, I was genuinely happy for him. He'd been alone for over a decade and deserved companionship and happiness in his later years. Natalie seemed to bring out a more social, relaxed side of his personality, and I thought having a blended family might be good for all of us. But things started changing pretty quickly after the wedding. Natalie had strong opinions about how Dad should be spending his money and managing his business, where he'd always been conservative with expenses and focused on long-term financial planning. She encouraged him to enjoy his success and live more lavishly. She convinced him to buy a bigger house, lease expensive cars, and take costly vacations that strained his budget. More concerning was how Natalie positioned her kids in Dad's life. Andrew had been drifting between part-time jobs and was constantly asking for financial help with everything from car repairs to rent payments. Melissa had dropped out of college twice and was pursuing an expensive art degree that she claimed would lead to a lucrative career as a graphic designer. Both of them seemed to view Dad as their new financial safety net. Dad, being the generous person he was, started helping Andrew and Melissa with their expenses. He'd cover Andrew's rent when he was between jobs and pay for Melissa's art supplies and tuition. He told me he felt responsible for helping his new stepchildren get established and that he wanted to be a positive influence in their lives. I supported Dad's desire to help his new family, but I started getting concerned about the financial impact on his retirement planning. Dad had worked hard for 40 years to build his accounting practice and accumulate enough savings to retire comfortably. He'd always been careful about money and had specific plans for how his assets would support him in his later years. But Natalie's influence was pushing him toward much more expensive lifestyle choices that were eating into his retirement savings. She'd convinced him that he deserved to enjoy his success while he was still healthy enough to travel and experience new things. She talked about how life was short and money was meant to be spent on creating memories with the people you love. About 2 years into their marriage, Dad mentioned that he was updating his will to include his new family. He said it was important to make sure Natalie would be taken care of if something happened to him, and that he wanted to treat Andrew and Melissa fairly as his stepchildren. He assured me that I would still inherit the bulk of his estate, including his business and the house, but that he was setting aside some money for Natalie and her kids. I understood Dad's reasoning and supported his decision to include his new family in his estate planning. It seemed fair that Natalie should have some financial security, and I didn't begrudge Andrew and Melissa receiving something from Dad after he'd been helping support them for years. What I didn't realize was that Natalie had been working systematically to increase her family's share of Dad's estate while minimizing mine. She'd been researching estate law and talking to Dad about how blended families should handle inheritance issues. She'd convinced him that leaving everything to his biological son would be unfair to the stepchildren who had come to depend on his support. Over the following months, Dad mentioned several times that he was making adjustments to his will as his family situation evolved. Natalie would bring up specific scenarios. What would happen if Dad became incapacitated? How to ensure Andrew and Melissa could finish their education? How to make sure she could maintain the house if Dad died first? Each conversation led to modifications that seemed reasonable in isolation but added up to major changes in how his assets would be distributed. I started getting worried when Dad mentioned that Natalie had been attending his meetings with his estate planning lawyer. She claimed she wanted to understand the legal complexities so she could be helpful during the planning process. Dad thought it was sweet that she was taking such an active interest in securing the family's future. But I knew Natalie well enough by then to recognize that her involvement wasn't about being helpful. It was about gaining control over the process. She'd been studying estate law and inheritance regulations, positioning herself as the expert who could guide Dad toward the most fair and practical distribution of his assets. The final red flag came about 6 months before Dad died, when he mentioned that his lawyer had suggested creating a trust structure that would provide ongoing support for his stepchildren while protecting the assets from potential creditors or legal problems. Dad seemed proud that he was setting up such sophisticated financial planning, but I suspected Natalie had been the one pushing for these complex arrangements. What I didn't know was that Dad had started to have his own concerns about Natalie's motivations and had been taking steps to protect his estate that she knew nothing about. He'd been watching how his generosity was affecting Andrew and Melissa's work ethic and independence, and he'd started questioning whether leaving them substantial inheritances would actually help them or enable their dependence. Dad died suddenly from a heart attack 3 months ago, and that's when Natalie's true plans finally became clear. The woman who had seemed like a loving stepmother for 3 years was about to reveal exactly what she'd been working toward since the day she married my father. Dad's funeral was on a Thursday, and by Saturday morning Natalie was already talking about getting the estate matters settled quickly so everyone could move forward with their lives. She seemed remarkably composed for someone who had supposedly lost the love of her life just 2 days earlier. While I was still processing my grief, she was focused on legal paperwork and asset transfers. Natalie called Dad's lawyer, Mitchell Hayes, that weekend to schedule a will reading for the following Tuesday. She said she wanted all the beneficiaries present so there wouldn't be any confusion about Dad's wishes. She seemed confident and in control, like someone who knew exactly what the documents were going to say. When Tuesday arrived, I met Natalie, Andrew, and Melissa at Mitchell's law office downtown. The atmosphere was tense but expectant, like we were all waiting for an important business announcement rather than learning how a deceased family member had chosen to distribute his life's work. Mitchell started by expressing his condolences and explaining the process for executing Dad's will. He mentioned that Dad had been very thorough in his estate planning and had made several updates over the past few years to ensure his wishes were clearly documented. Natalie nodded approvingly, as if she was already familiar with the contents. Then Mitchell opened what appeared to be the most recent version of Dad's will and began reading the key provisions. According to this document, Dad had left the house to Natalie with the understanding that she would live there as long as she wanted. His business and professional assets were to be sold, with the proceeds divided equally among Natalie, Andrew, Melissa, and me. Most shocking was the provision that left his personal savings and investment accounts, about $400,000, entirely to Natalie, Andrew, and Melissa, with me receiving only a small inheritance of $25,000 and some personal items that had belonged to my mother. The will stated that Dad wanted to ensure his stepchildren had the same opportunities as his biological son, and felt that I was already financially stable enough to not need substantial inheritance. I was stunned. This wasn't anything like what Dad had described to me over the years. He'd always talked about leaving me the bulk of his estate, with provisions for Natalie and her kids, but not as the primary beneficiaries. The will Mitchell was reading sounded like Dad had completely changed his priorities and decided that his stepchildren needed his wealth more than his own son did. Natalie was trying to look surprised and emotional, dabbing at her eyes with tissues while expressing shock that Samuel had been so generous to her family. She kept saying things like, "He didn't need to do this," and "I had no idea he felt this way about Andrew and Melissa." But I could see the satisfaction in her expression. This was exactly what she'd been working toward. Andrew and Melissa seemed genuinely surprised, but quickly shifted into discussions about how they'd use their inheritances. Andrew talked about finally being able to start his own business, while Melissa mentioned finishing her art degree and maybe buying a condo. They were already spending money they hadn't received yet, treating the inheritance like a lottery win rather than a solemn family responsibility. Mitchell explained that there would be a standard waiting period before the will could be executed, during which time any challenges or questions could be raised. He asked if anyone had concerns about the document or needed clarification about any of the provisions. Natalie quickly said that everything seemed clear and that Dad's wishes should be respected exactly as written. But something felt wrong to me about the entire situation. The language in the will didn't sound like Dad's values or the way he spoke about family responsibilities. The reasoning for leaving me such a small inheritance was based on assumptions about my financial situation that Dad had never expressed to me directly. Most importantly, the will seemed to reward Andrew and Melissa's dependence rather than encouraging the independence and self-reliance that Dad had always valued. I asked Mitchell if I could see the will document myself, and he handed me a copy to review. As I read through the legal language, I noticed that several provisions had been amended or modified, with new sections inserted that seemed to override earlier language. The document looked like it had been revised multiple times, with the most recent changes heavily favoring Natalie and her children. More suspicious was a section that appointed Natalie as the executor of the estate, giving her control over the asset distribution process and the authority to make decisions about timing and implementation. This meant she would be in charge of selling Dad's business, distributing the proceeds, and managing any disputes that arose during the probate process. After the meeting, I drove home feeling confused and betrayed. The father I'd known for 32 years wouldn't have structured his estate in a way that left his only son with almost nothing while enriching stepchildren he'd known for less than 3 years. The values expressed in the will were completely inconsistent with everything Dad had taught me about fairness, responsibility, and family loyalty. That evening, I called Mitchell's office and requested a private meeting to discuss my concerns about the will. I wanted to understand the timeline of when various changes had been made and whether Dad had been under any external pressure when he'd made his final decisions about asset distribution. Mitchell agreed to meet with me the following day, and when I arrived at his office, his expression suggested he'd been expecting my call. He asked me to sit down and said he had some things to explain about my father's estate planning that hadn't been covered during the formal will reading. That's when Mitchell revealed something that changed everything I thought I knew about Dad's final intentions and Natalie's role in shaping them. It turned out that the will we'd reviewed on Tuesday wasn't the only version Dad had created, and Natalie's influence over the estate planning process had been more manipulative than I'd realized. But Dad had been paying attention to what was happening, and he'd taken steps to protect his estate that Natalie never knew about. The woman who thought she'd been controlling the narrative was about to discover that my father had been writing a different story entirely. Mitchell leaned back in his chair and studied my face for a moment before speaking. "Oliver, your father was a very smart man who understood people better than they gave him credit for. He came to see me privately about 6 months before he died, and what he told me during that meeting explains everything you're feeling right now about that will." He opened a locked filing cabinet and pulled out another folder, much thicker than the one he'd brought to Tuesday's reading. "Your father suspected that Natalie was manipulating him into changing his estate plans for her family's benefit rather than making decisions based on his own values and priorities. He was concerned about the pressure she was putting on him and the way Andrew and Melissa were becoming increasingly dependent on his financial support." Mitchell explained that Dad had started noticing troubling patterns in Natalie's behavior around money and inheritance planning. She would bring up hypothetical scenarios about what would happen to her kids if something happened to Dad, always emphasizing how much they needed his support to succeed in life. She'd research estate law and bring him articles about how modern blended families should handle inheritance issues. Most manipulatively, Natalie had been scheduling joint meetings with Mitchell where she would guide the conversation toward specific changes that would benefit her family. She'd present these suggestions as if they were Dad's ideas, saying things like, "Samuel was telling me last night that he's concerned about Andrew's future," or, "We both think it would be fair to treat all the children equally." Dad had initially thought Natalie was being helpful and supportive by taking such an active interest in estate planning. But over time, he realized that every conversation and every modification was pushing the inheritance away from me and toward her children. He started feeling like he was being manipulated rather than making free choices about his own assets. "So your father came to me with a request," Mitchell continued. "He wanted to create what's called a decoy will, a version that Natalie would know about and think was his final decision. while keeping his real intentions in a separate, secret document that would be his actual last will and testament. Mitchell pulled out the second document and handed it to me. "This is your father's real will, Oliver. The one Natalie never saw and never influenced. He spent months crafting this version to reflect his true values and intentions for his estate." As I read through the real will, I felt a mixture of relief and sadness that brought tears to my eyes. This document sounded like my father, thoughtful, fair, and consistent with everything he'd taught me about responsibility and earned success. The real will left me the house, Dad's business, and the majority of his financial assets, totaling about $800,000. Natalie received $50,000 and the right to live in the house for 1 year while she made arrangements for her own housing. Andrew and Melissa each received $10,000 with a provision that they could earn additional amounts by completing specific educational or professional milestones within 2 years. Most importantly, the real will included a detailed explanation of Dad's reasoning for these decisions. He wrote that while he loved his new family, he believed that substantial unearned inheritances would harm Andrew and Melissa's development into independent, self-reliant adults. He wanted to provide them with seed money that could help them build their own success, but not enough to eliminate their motivation to work and achieve. The will also included specific observations about Natalie's behavior that showed Dad had been paying much closer attention than she'd realized. He documented instances where she'd pressured him to change estate provisions, times when she'd misrepresented their financial conversations to Mitchell, and examples of how Andrew and Melissa's dependence had increased rather than decreased despite his ongoing support. "Your father was quite strategic about this," Mitchell explained. "He continued attending meetings with Natalie and allowing her to influence the decoy will, but he was actually observing her behavior and using those observations to inform his real estate planning decisions. He wanted to see how far she would push her agenda and whether she was capable of prioritizing his wishes over her family's financial interests." The answer, of course, was that Natalie had prioritized her children's inheritance over Dad's values and intentions at every opportunity. She'd systematically worked to minimize my inheritance while maximizing theirs, using emotional manipulation and strategic research to reshape Dad's estate planning in ways that served her agenda. Mitchell also revealed that Dad had been documenting Natalie's manipulation tactics for months. He'd kept records of their conversations about inheritance planning, saved emails where she'd made suggestions about will modifications, and even recorded some of their discussions when he'd started feeling pressure to make changes he wasn't comfortable with. "Your father wanted to make sure that if Natalie challenged the real will, there would be clear evidence of her attempts to manipulate the estate planning process," Mitchell said. He was protecting his true intentions from someone he'd grown to distrust, while maintaining the appearance of cooperation to avoid family conflict during his lifetime. The most emotional part of the real will was a personal letter Dad had written to me, explaining his decision-making process and expressing his love and pride in the man I'd become. He wrote about how hard it had been to watch Natalie's true character emerge after their marriage, and how concerned he'd become about the impact her values were having on Andrew and Melissa. Dad also apologized for not being more direct with me about what was happening during his lifetime. He'd chosen to handle the situation privately rather than creating family drama, but he wanted me to understand that he'd never stopped prioritizing our relationship and my future security. Reading Dad's letter, I realized that he'd been protecting both his estate and his relationship with me by allowing Natalie to think she was succeeding in her manipulation while actually maintaining control over his real intentions. He'd outsmarted someone who thought she was outsmarting him. Now came the difficult part, revealing the truth to Natalie and watching her discover that years of careful planning had been completely undermined by the man she thought she'd been controlling. Mitchell scheduled another family meeting for the following Friday, telling Natalie that there were some additional estate documents that needed to be reviewed before the probate process could move forward. He didn't give her any details about what those documents contained, just said that Dad had been very thorough in his planning and there were multiple versions of various legal instruments. When Friday arrived, the atmosphere in Mitchell's office was very different from the previous week. Natalie seemed confident and slightly impatient, like someone who just wanted to get through the formalities so she could start accessing her inheritance. Andrew and Melissa looked bored, probably wondering why they needed to sit through more legal paperwork when the important decisions had already been announced. I was nervous, but also excited to see Natalie's reaction when she discovered that all her careful manipulation had been for nothing. Dad had given her exactly what she deserved based on her true character rather than what she tried to manipulate him into providing. Mitchell started by explaining that estate planning is often a complex process involving multiple documents and revisions, especially when family situations change over time. He said that executors and beneficiaries needed to be aware of all relevant legal instruments to ensure that the deceased person's true wishes were properly implemented. In Samuel's case, Mitchell continued, he created what we call a comprehensive estate planning strategy that involved multiple versions of key documents. Some of these were working drafts or preliminary versions, while others represent his final, legally binding decisions about asset distribution. Natalie looked confused, but not yet concerned. She asked if there were any changes to what had been read the previous week, clearly expecting Mitchell to say that everything remained the same and they could proceed with implementing the will she'd been influencing for months. Instead, Mitchell pulled out the folder containing Dad's real will and placed it on the table. What I read to you last Tuesday was actually a preliminary version that Samuel had been working on with input from various family members. Today, I need to share with you his final, legally executed will that represents his actual intentions for estate distribution. The room went completely silent as Mitchell opened the real will and began reading its contents. With each provision that differed from the previous week's reading, I could see Natalie's expression shifting from confusion to concern to barely contain panic. When Mitchell reached the sections about my inheritance, the house, the business, the majority of Dad's assets, Natalie interrupted with a sharp, "That can't be right." She demanded to see the document herself, studying the signature and date with obvious desperation. "This doesn't make sense," she said, her voice getting higher and more strained. "Samuel and I talked about all of this together. He wanted to make sure Andrew and Melissa were taken care of. He said Oliver was already successful and didn't need as much support." Mitchell calmly explained that Dad had indeed discussed various estate planning options with multiple people, but that his final decisions were documented in the will he was currently reading. He mentioned that Dad had been very deliberate about ensuring his true wishes were clearly expressed and legally protected. Andrew and Melissa looked stunned as they realized their expected inheritances had shrunk from hundreds of thousands of dollars to $10,000 each. Melissa actually started crying, saying that Dad had promised to help her finish school and start her career. Andrew got angry, claiming that Dad had led them to believe they would be treated as equal beneficiaries with me. But Natalie's reaction was the most telling. Instead of expressing grief about losing her husband's support, she was furious about losing control over his assets. She demanded to know when the real will had been created and whether Dad had been influenced by someone else to change his mind about his stepfamily. Samuel was confused in his final months, she claimed desperately. He wasn't thinking clearly about these decisions. Someone must have pressured him to change his will without understanding what we'd planned together. That's when Mitchell revealed the most damaging evidence against Natalie. He pulled out Dad's documentation of her manipulation tactics, the recorded conversations, the saved emails, the timeline of her suggestions and pressure campaigns. He explained that Dad had been systematically documenting Natalie's attempts to influence his estate planning specifically because he'd grown concerned about her motivations. Samuel was very clear about his reasoning for these decisions, Mitchell said, reading from Dad's notes. He felt that Natalie had prioritized her children's financial benefit over his own values and wishes. He was concerned that large inheritances would harm Andrew and Melissa's development, and he was disappointed by what he perceived as Natalie's manipulation of the estate planning process. Natalie tried to deny Dad's observations, claiming that she'd only been trying to help him think through complex family dynamics and ensure everyone was treated fairly. But the evidence was overwhelming. Months of documented conversations where she'd pushed specific changes that would benefit her family while minimizing my inheritance. The meeting ended with Natalie demanding to contest the will, claiming that Dad had been mentally impaired or under undue influence when he'd created his final version. But Mitchell had anticipated this response and had documentation of Dad's mental competency right up until his death, including statements from his doctor and business associates confirming his clear thinking and decision-making ability. More importantly, The recorded evidence of Natalie's manipulation actually supported Dad's claims about undue influence, except it showed that she had been the one trying to inappropriately influence his decisions rather than him being influenced by others to exclude her family. Within 2 weeks, Natalie's attorney advised her to accept the terms of Dad's will rather than pursue a costly and embarrassing court battle that would expose her manipulation tactics to public scrutiny. She took the $50,000 inheritance and moved out of Dad's house, taking Andrew and Melissa with her to find more affordable housing. The business sale generated enough money to pay off all of Dad's debts and provide me with a substantial inheritance that honored both his financial success and his values about family responsibility. Andrew and Melissa received their $10,000 inheritances, but had to find jobs and make their own way in the world without the safety net they'd been expecting. 6 months later, I heard through mutual acquaintances that Natalie had started dating another older man with substantial assets and adult children from previous relationships. Apparently, she'd learned from her experience with Dad and was being more careful about her approach to blended family dynamics and estate planning. I later heard that Andrew and Melissa had actually thrived with their smaller inheritances. Without relying on unearned wealth, they found steady jobs. Andrew started a landscaping business, and Melissa finished her degree and launched a freelance design career. In hindsight, Dad's will was a masterclass in understanding people. He gave everyone not what they wanted, but what they needed. Natalie learned that manipulation has consequences, Andrew and Melissa learned the value of independence, and I inherited not just his assets, but his values. Dad had spent his final months playing a complex game of chess with someone who thought she was manipulating him, while actually documenting her behavior and protecting his true intentions. His will wasn't just about money. It was about justice, character, and ensuring that his life's work would continue to reflect his values long after he was gone. The woman who thought she'd been rewriting my father's story had discovered that he'd been writing the ending all along.